Mira, ahora está, ya está. Esto es reincorporaros a lo grande, ¿no? Los dos.
Sí, sí.
Ha venido del día. Mira, vigila con la placa. Porque no, es que no sé en qué momento Xavier va a querer mostrarla, vale. que no nos cargue ningún bien. ¿Vale? Pero la pondré aquí. Cuando Xavier la mueva, no os dé un golpecito a nada. ¿Vale? También tiene que tomar cuidado. Vale, ya estaría cubierta. Vale. Oberto, haremos así. Vale, diga mamá.
Que ja tinc ofici. És que no, saps que
Vale, pues te lleva a entregar.
Es menos sensible a las temperaturas.
Bon dia, disculpeu, estem fent unes proves de so.
Sí.
Bon dia, disculpeu, estem fent unes proves de so. Bon dia, disculpeu, estem fent unes proves de so. Bon dia, disculpeu, estem fent unes proves de so.
Bon dia a tothom. I moltes gràcies per estar aquí amb nosaltres en aquest acte d'homenatge al professor, investigador, recercaire, company, sotsdirector de l'Institut, el doctor Toni, Rosell i Muller, que de forma sobtada ens va deixar a finals de l'any passat. Han transcorregut alguns mesos i des de l'àmbit acadèmic, des de l'àmbit recercaire, volíem retre aquest homenatge a qui va ser el nostre company Toni, amb les institucions que li havien donat acollida durant aquestes dècades de vida científica i també, sobretot, amb els que li vam donar acollida aquest segle XXI, perquè ell arribà altra vegada a Catalunya a principis del segle XXI gràcies a ICREA. Va ser un dels primers ICREAs aquí a l'Autònom. I volíem fer també aquest reconeixement de la mà de la família, a qui agraïm moltíssim, perquè potser són la part que més ho viu, a vegades les conseqüències. És a dir, els que quedem, els que quedeu. La seva dona, el seu pare, les seves filles, germana i altres familiars. Per tant, a tots vosaltres, aquest agraïment en nom de l'Institut de Ciència i Tecnologia Ambientals de la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Intentaré conduir aquest acte, que volem que sigui senzill, però a la vegada emotiu, des de la vessant acadèmica, científica, com a recercaire, perquè poden haver-hi moltes altres vessants. Hem volgut anar als orígens com a recercaire, quan ja ets investigador, investigadora, amb les primeres persones que estàs formant. I és per això que li vam demanar a l'Erin i també al James que ens poguessin acompanyar avui aquí, perquè van ser de les primeres persones que també ell va poder tenir l'oportunitat de formar. Poder tenir el seu testimoni des d'una altra perspectiva, des de l'Erin, des de la Universitat de Durham i el James des de la Universitat de Birmingham. Per tant, començarem aquest acte amb la introducció de la doctora Erin McLean, perdoneu el meu anglès, i a continuació el James Battle. Malauradament, ell ho haurà de fer per videoconferència, perquè finalment ahir no va poder pujar a l'avió. Estava previst que estigués aquí, però esperem que no hi hagi cap problema tècnic i que puguem tenir també aquí entre nosaltres. També vull agrair a totes aquelles persones que ens esteu seguint pel canal YouTube i, per tant, sabem que l'aula era la sala, té la capacitat que té, tampoc no podem fer cap abús perquè estem bé sanitàriament, però amb alguna restricció i, per tant, és molt important que tots mantinguem la mascareta, excepte si convé la persona que parla, donat que ja podem tenir 1,5 metres, 2 metres de distància. Per tant, jo agrairia, si l'Erin pot començar amb la seva intervenció i amb aquest record emotiu del doctor Toni Rosell.
Dear Toni's family, friends, and colleagues, James and I would like to talk today about just some of Toni's achievements as we remember so many of his contributions to science. We were both PhD students with Toni at Durham, and we continue to work with him as our careers developed. It's been a difficult task to summarize a career which has involved more than 100 publications, supported by more than 20 funding organizations and millions of euros. He worked with many students, researchers, and collaborators. Toni often also returned to the same themes through his career, either time windows or places, as though there were some science questions that were itches that needed to be scratched. But the impact of his work is clear. He was invited several times to review the state of the science, and his publications have been cited more than 5,000 times. In our talks, James and I will touch on just some of those scientific achievements and impacts, recognizing that in doing so, we also miss a lot of important work. But I also want to show some of the less easily measured influences, particularly in terms of community building to address important questions. We know how proud Toni was of his Catalan roots, and he particularly enjoyed showing and describing images like these of your famous human towers. He would describe the risks and the hard work and the teamwork, but also the achievements of these towers with great pride. But he also used these with us as an example of how science could be successfully achieved. At various stages of Toni's endeavors, he took up different positions in our scientific towers. But critically though, he always contributed with the highest quality data to address many important environmental questions. To start, it's important to introduce the biomarkers, those chemical tools that are synonymous with Toni and which opened up so many areas of research. A biomarker is a chemical fossil produced by biological processes, and it's a marker because we know where it came from. Importantly, we need to be able to get biomarkers out of those environmental samples, to analyze them and to understand the environment better. And this is no easy task. The biomarkers which Toni first worked on are the alkanones, generated by microscopic coccolithophores, which photosynthesize in the surface ocean. The importance of these alkanones comes from the changes in their chemistry, which reflect the waters in which they are growing. And these can be quantified and used to reconstruct our climates of the past. Biomarkers are not perfect, and Toni would be the first to tell you that, but they do give us records of climate which are independent from other fossil types, often giving complementary or different insights into environmental change. One of the reasons it has been hard to focus on Toni's scientific impacts is that biomarkers are found everywhere, and they have interesting tales to tell wherever they are found, and Toni would usually find them. This illustration shows just some of the connections we see between biological productivity in the ocean and its interactions with land, and Toni addressed many of these pathways in his research. But you can also add to this graphic the lakes and the archaeology that Toni was also involved with, as well as the transport of biomarkers by ice sheets and icebergs. Toni managed to work across a wide range of environments and timescales, but also considered both natural environmental changes of the past and human impacts on the environment today. The biomarker work began during Toni's PhD studies at Bristol, during which he wrote 4 first author papers and contributed to another 4. His aim there was to study and validate the alkanone proxy, the UK37 index, and other related biomarkers, to reconstruct sea surface temperatures and to carry out climate reconstructions during our most recent geological time period, the late Quaternary. but I think his Future Outlook chapter gives us a good example of how he always combined his expertise in chemistry and analytical instruments with environmental problems and questions. So in this chapter, he called on us to generate the best data possible in the lab, and he even makes mention of robots in this chapter. He also asks us to assess any biases and uncertainties, including using interlab comparisons. But he also wanted to expand his surface sediment dataset more globally and wanted to produce high-resolution climate records to better understand the processes underpinning climate change. I think it's safe to say that he managed to address all of these themes, and James and I will touch on some of them in our talks. So my focus this morning is to talk about past climates, how we can reconstruct them and quantify those changes, and the new knowledge that we've gained as a result. I will talk about relatively long timescales, spanning thousands and millions of years, recognizing that Toni also made important discoveries about more recent climate change too. I'd like to talk about three themes this morning. The first is to consider how different was the ocean of the last ice age. The second, how do oceans and ice sheets interact? And finally, to think about how our climate has changed over the last 5 million years as we have moved from a relatively warm climate to the icehouse climate we know today. So to the first of these themes, looking at the last ice age. Around 20,000 years ago, we know that there were large ice sheets which had grown over North America and Europe, and they were several kilometers thick. The Antarctic ice sheet and Greenland ice sheet had also expanded. And Toni was interested to understand what difference this would have made to the oceans at that time. This work began during his PhD thesis with a particular focus on the Atlantic Ocean. He was able to show with these new biomarker tools that the ocean was colder during the glaciation and that you could track the warming towards the present day. But this illustration also shows that he was able to reconstruct individual components of the marine ecosystem, looking at productivity change in the ocean. He was also able to identify organic matter coming into the ocean from the land. The importance of this work is that normally this would all be hidden in the lowermost panel here under total organic carbon %. So with these new tools, we could get a much richer understanding of environmental change through time. But Toni's work also threw up a number of challenges. The alkanones were sometimes hard to recover. They were sometimes very difficult to identify confidently. And they also sometimes gave some unexpected warmings during the ice age, which made others doubt if the technique was working. Detailed studies addressing all of these challenges soon emerged. But alongside reconstructing the warming trends using alkanones, Toni also led an effort to compare the surface sediments of the seafloor with modern measurements of ocean temperature. The aim was to calibrate the alkanone proxy. He showed that in the real environment, the alkanones were recording changes in ocean temperature, confirming what had been seen in lab experiments. This work was then expanded into a near global calibration, known as the Muller Calibration, which is still being employed today and has been used almost 800 times. This development was extremely important. We could now confirm that real temperatures could be generated from ocean sediments. This opened the door to mapping temperature change, using differences to understand how circulation has changed in the past, and to making comparisons with climate models which were being used to reconstruct the past and project our futures. There was considerable debate at that time about how cool the tropics had become during that maximum ice age. Here is shown a plot of tropical temperature change on land along the top compared to ocean cooling down the side. The existing data, which you may be able to see here in green, just did not match the outputs which were coming from the models. And this mismatch was also impacting the ability of those climate models to replicate the data we had. Toni led a synthesis effort for the tropical Alkaline data and showed that actually at many sites there had been a cooling of around 2 to 3 degrees centigrade. This Alkaline synthesis gave support to the newly emerging models and triggered some reassessment of the signals recorded by different techniques. The significance of this work is shown by the fact I took this graphic from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its summary of the state of science in 2001. The tropical synthesis work also triggered some new initiatives, bringing colleagues together from different disciplines to make a global assessment of how the oceans have changed through time. And this really started with the Margot Synthesis project. An important part of Margot was to assess the uncertainties and be transparent about them. And the leader of Margot, Claire Walbrook, remembers Toni playing an important role in advising how to work with the Alkaline data. The synthesis work was hard fought, taking 4 workshops, including one here near Barcelona, and a lot of effort in between, as well as follow-up activities. But the result of this work was the Margot synthesis. This generated the most detailed, robust outline of the last glacial ocean and was published in 2005. And to highlight here that they were acknowledging the uncertainties in the data, you may see that there are areas shaded grey where the data either did not exist or was not of high enough quality to be included in the synthesis. During his PhD, Toni also recognized that in the North Atlantic region, where the ice sheets dip their toes into the ocean, there might also be a biomarker record to allow us to understand more about what the ice sheets were doing and how they might have interacted with the ocean. Layers of iceberg-rafted sediment had been identified in the North Atlantic, called Heinrich events, but the details of where they came from and if that had changed through time had been hard to assess. Starting in the early 2000s, Toni used the sediments beneath the ice sheets to generate biomarker fingerprints for each of those ice sheets in turn. The work included research cruises, as well as contributions from a large number of researchers and students. Through this work, Toni was able to confirm that the icebergs were not responsible for some unusual Alkaline data, but also identified these individual fingerprints from the different ice sheets in turn, and was also able to show that different ice sheets deposited material at different times. These ideas, however, took a long time to develop and were not always recognized because they challenged some existing paradigms. It was not plain sailing to get the results, but the results are here. During these early days, Toni was also trying to instill his enthusiasm for environmental science into our students at Durham. Colleagues have recalled occasions where he pushed the students maybe further than they appreciated. On one occasion, he had to get them to push his minibus up the hill in order to identify the last British ice sheet on a field trip. Or as these photos show, when his love of sailing prompted an unexpected excursion of our tiny department boat into the North Sea, under the banner of giving the students the full marine science experience. Judging by the seasickness, they certainly had an experience of some form, but it was perhaps not the motivational one that Toni was hoping for. In 2006, I also benefited from Toni's enthusiasm for working at sea when he asked me to join his Fate Fuel expedition, investigating the impact of the Prestige oil tanker sinking. This photo shows us happily setting sail from Vigo into an impending storm, which also gave me the worst 2 days of seasickness I've ever experienced in my life. Toni took great delight in teasing me about that for years to come. But of course, he was right that it would be an important, formative, and ultimately enjoyable experience. I want to finish up this talk by outlining a research theme where I think Toni's work has had a huge impact. And that is in trying to understand how our climate system has evolved from the warm climate of the Pliocene towards the ice ages of the Pleistocene. We sit on the left of this diagram, just after the last ice age shown in blue. But as we push back through time, we see that the cycles get smaller and shorter, and the climate as a whole is warmer. Toni was interested to understand how the wider climate system changed as the ice sheets and the ice ages evolved. This work started during Toni's time in Bristol, when a PhD student called Gerald Haug visited the lab with some samples taken from a site in the North Pacific. Gerald was working on a range of data sets and worked with Toni to generate an Alkanone record across an interval of ice sheet growth around 2.7 million years ago. But the Alkanone data looked strange. It showed warming at a time of ice sheet growth when everything else seemed to show evidence of cooling. But this work was important because through their understanding of the proxies and the data, Gerald and Toni were able to explain these differences and also find a way to link the results back to the ice sheets. They were able to explain that warmer summers shown by the Alkanones, in combination with cooler winters from the other data, were consistent with providing more snow over North America, which could then in turn cause ice sheet growth. In the early 2000s, Toni and I also applied the same techniques to several sites across another ice sheet expansion around 1 million years ago. Here, the biomarker data showed shifting polar water masses in the North Atlantic and North Pacific. But we could also show an intensification of tropical Pacific circulation. These events were also consistent with increasing snowfall over the ice sheet regions in North America and Scandinavia, and provided another mechanism to help ice sheet growth. Toni also regularly returned to the low latitudes, to a region he'd started working on during his PhD thesis in the Southeast Atlantic. Here, the Benguela upwelling system brings cold, nutrient-rich waters to the sea surface, as shown with the blues and purples. This system is important because it influences the desert environment onshore and is also tightly connected to the wind systems. Through a series of studies, starting with Jeremy Marlowe's PhD, Toni was able to show that the center of this system had cooled by more than 15 degrees centigrade, which is a huge change across a few million years. By comparing the data at different sites, he was also able to piece together the intensification and migration of this system northwards through time, and linked it to changes occurring in the tropical Pacific too. But a question kept returning. Why would the South Atlantic be changing during a time of ice sheet changes in the north? Today, we understand that this system is influenced by the wind and also by ocean circulation to the south. And to the south, Toni looked. With the arrival of Alfredo Martinez Garcia as a PhD student came some of the most novel and exciting data. They focused on Site 1090 and reconstructed temperatures, dust, productivity changes, and polar water mass distributions for the last 4 million years. They showed that dust increases had caused increased productivity to the surface ocean, transferring CO2 out of the atmosphere. They also showed polar waters expanding and cooling in both the South Atlantic, but also in that same North Pacific site that Toni worked on with Gerald. They made connections to changes in tropical circulation and to ice sheet growth. The power of these records comes in the combined biological, geochemical, and physical changes in the climate system, which they could reconstruct, extending over millions of years. Over the last 20 years, the warm climate of the past, the Pliocene, has also changed from being something interesting to something very relevant for our future. The Pliocene had CO2 concentrations similar to today, so that understanding its climate better could help inform us of where we are heading. But Toni recognized that there were uncertainties and limitations around the data and the models, and that data quality and its interpretations needed to be considered. Applying his Margot experience, he asked Carlos Pelejero and I to help him convene a workshop here in Barcelona to ask whether a community initiative would be welcome and to get that initiative started. We had about 80 participants who still remember a very warm Barcelona welcome and Toni's pride in his city. The workshop led to a community initiative called Playa, which is focused on synthesizing and understanding the best quality data we can find for an important warm period of our past. Toni was reluctant to be found at the front of the photo at the top. He's hiding away in the back row, but we caught him in Durham when we had our marine synthesis workshop. And this initiative also continues to remain active. So to conclude, I hope I've been able to show you just some of the wide-ranging contributions Toni has made to understanding really big questions about our environment, that we can quantify how and why climate has changed over the last 5 million years, but that importantly, this work is always underpinned by robust understanding of the instruments, the environmental processes, and the need for community. Thank you.
Right, SY vision, how we can build a human tower in the science field. And now, as I said before, James Bendler, also, and another of the one's PhD students will be share with us and remind his experience when he started more focused. We will do it through the webcam by video conference.
Thank you. Just can I just check that you can hear me okay? Great. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this. I'm sorry that I couldn't make it in person, but very much wish I could be there with all of you, and thank you to those joining online as well. Thank you to Erin for that fantastic oversight of just the key elements of Toni's contribution, which is absolutely huge. I'm going to talk now about my PhD with Toni and how his influence as an analytical chemist, has shaped my own career and how really it had come full circle in the years before Toni's death, and we'd started to work together on new tools and techniques. So this talk is called New Tools for Reconstructing Terrestrial and Marine Climate. And I started my research journey with a master's at London with Mark Maslin, and it was Mark who, and I got very interested in oceanography, paleoceanography through that, and it was Mark who introduced me to Toni. And said, there's this new, exciting new technique using molecular fossils, these things called biomarkers, and we started collaborating with Toni during my master's. Then that led to the PhD at Durham with Toni, and I was the second PhD student that he had after Jeremy Marlowe. It was myself, Erin, and Oksana, and then Mary as a postdoc that were in that group at that time. Which was Toni's first lab group that he'd built with a permanent position. So then he moved to Barcelona and obviously set up a fantastic group in ICTA. Subsequently, I moved to Japan for several years. Then I came back and did a postdoc in Bristol, worked set up my own group, applying lots of the things that I'd learned from Toni about how to set up a lab group and how to mentor PhD students and try to develop people's careers. And I could apply that for the first time in Glasgow, where I was from 2007 to 2012. And then subsequently in Birmingham from 2012 onwards, I've been working with a large group of other paleoclimatologists there. And really fortunate to have had this opportunity to work with people all over the world and many different settings, both in marine, terrestrial, ice cores. All of those experiences started with the opportunity that Toni gave me. And I want to focus on two research themes, developing somewhat from what Erin mentioned. So climate evolution, understanding climate change in the past and various different timescales to predict the future, and developing geochemical techniques to do that. And that's what Toni was so brilliant at doing, at developing and refining those techniques with an eye to new techniques and also community efforts and data quality. So I started my own journey by building on Toni's research with alkaline biomarkers, these incredible molecules, fats produced by algae that live in the oceans and in lakes that occur in such abundance they can be seen by satellite. And that the way they change the structure of those compounds, how unsaturated they are depending on sea surface temperature. And as Erin mentioned, Toni loved sailing and loved the ocean. And some of my earliest experiences as a PhD student was sailing for 5 weeks in the Arctic with Toni, collecting these algae from the ocean surface to try and understand how they were behaving in situ, to collect them in the environment they were growing in. And to do that, we built this, Toni and I, with the help of technicians at Durham, built this contraption to filter and collect these algae. And one of the first results from my PhD from this effort was to look at where this technique that could be used to reconstruct sea surface temperatures, to try and push its geographic extent. Toni understood, and you would have seen that from Erin's talk, the importance of understanding the behavior of ice sheets. It's probably the biggest concern as we go into the future for climate change is how ice sheets will respond and to changes in sea surface temperature. And so data from the polar regions is critical. But we found that the alkaline technique for reconstructing sea surface temperatures did not really work very well in truly polar waters, highlighted here in red, but it did work in subpolar areas, these sample sites highlighted in blue. So that meant that we could apply this technique to the area around Iceland, which is something we were interested in. And so I was working together with Toni. We produced the first high-resolution record of alkaline sea surface temperatures from a continental shelf site. So previously, this approach had been applied to the deep ocean, but to apply to the continental shelf requires overcoming some technical challenges, because the concentrations of these compounds are lower because they get diluted by all of the sediments that are coming in on the shelf. So that was Toni's technical expertise as an analytical chemist that really helped to overcome that. And we produced the first continental shelf reconstruction using alganones from the Icelandic shelf. And the main outcome of that was that we found that the evolution of sea surface temperatures in the last 10,000 years was more complex than had previously been assumed, characterized by differential responses of these two warm ocean currents in the east and west of the Nordic seas. But another outcome of this work was finding that the tetraunsaturated alkanone, this unusual alkanone, occurred in very high abundances in the polar water masses in areas where it couldn't be used for sea surface temperatures. We found that it could be used as a tracer for the input of polar water masses that carry sea ice. And then that is something that was applied later on. Erin showed some results showing the use of that technique to reconstruct the influence of polar water masses over many millions of years. Another thing that we did in the PhD with Toni was to look at a series of coastal basins around Scotland that were characterized by either being fresh lakes or fully marine sea logs, and a series of stages in between. And again, we found that these alkanins had an unusual fingerprint that could be identify whether these basins were either fully marine or brackish. And then this was another new technique that could be used to potentially reconstruct sea level change in these settings. And that is something that it's quite a specialized technique, but it's something that is still starting to be utilized in the present day. I recently examined a PhD at York where this technique was being used. So this figure shows the climate system, the carbon cycle, in a kind of cartoon form. And on this figure, you can see in red different groups of biomarkers that can be used, that are found in this in these environments and can be used to study the climate or carbon cycle. And Toni's influence on me really came partly from the fact that he was a chemical engineer, an analytical chemist by training, and he had a very broad knowledge of the different types of compounds that could occur in all different environments. He was brilliant at the technical challenge of analyzing them, and he was really creative in the way he thought about they could be used, and that's been a huge influence on me. So after my PhD with Toni, I studied plant waxes in Japan in atmospheric dust, and we used them to show that they could be used as a tracer to reconstruct atmospheric pathways based on the isotopic composition of those biomarkers. So a very different approach, but something that Toni was interested in. And Toni also used plant waxes himself very creatively in his papers. I then returned to working in marine settings, including in the tropics, but also returning to Iceland. And with my own first PhD student, applied both the alkaline technique and new techniques based on soil bacteria that Toni had also played a role in developing and that I was starting to help develop, to reconstruct both temperature and from both sea surface temperature and terrestrial temperature in high resolution from the Icelandic shelf. And then we're also applying a number of techniques to reconstruct changes in precipitation. So this was the first time that both precipitation, marine and terrestrial temperatures have been reconstructed in such detail from a continental shelf. And I was also fortunate enough to be involved in a number of ocean drilling expeditions, including IODP 318 to the Antarctic. I know Toni would have loved to have been on that expedition, given his love of high latitude marine environments. And that was an expedition that we combined various different biomarker techniques with pollen and spore to reconstruct remarkably warm conditions in the Eocene, a period of time 50 million years ago, when carbon dioxide levels were much higher than they are at the present day, but levels that we might reach in 100 years or so if we continue emissions unabated. And that created quite a bit of press attention at the time. I also worked in ice cores. So continuing some of the work that I'd started to develop in Japan, we used plant waxes to look at the potential influence of the loading of atmospheric dust, organic rich atmospheric dust in the atmosphere, and how this has changed over the last 1,000 years and may have helped to generate colder periods of time in the high latitudes, or amplify warmer periods of time over the last 1,000 years. So the last part of my talk is really looking back at the development of biomarker techniques through time since the 1960s, and how Toni's career and influence really runs throughout this. Toni's own supervisors at Bristol started this field of science in the 1960s and 70s. Toni worked on one of the first techniques that we had, alkanins, which you've heard about, to develop sea surface, to understand and reconstruct sea surface temperature. And then he's worked on all of the other key techniques in organic geochemistry, pretty much. In recent years, I've been fortunate enough to be working at the very beginning of the development of a new series of techniques based on 3 hydroxy fatty acids. These are produced by gram-negative bacteria. And I started to talk to Toni and got very excited about the potential applications of these. They are found on the surface of gram-negative bacteria. And they're actually been known to biomedical science for quite a while. They're what they'll look for if you get sick, and if they think you've consumed E. coli or an endotoxin. But they've really been overlooked for environmental techniques or applications. We now know that they can be found in soils, marine, lake settings, and are preserved in a number of geological archives. And in the last few years, we published, my group and a group in China working closely together, the first proof of concept papers that show that these compounds can reconstruct temperatures from soils and sea surface temperature settings. And that is something that we're really expanding, working with microbiologists to try and study these compounds everywhere. But the first application was another first for organic geochemistry, in that we were able to reconstruct temperature, changes in precipitation, and changes in the plant type from a stalagmite. So recovering biomarkers from a stalagmite in a cave in China. And it's this work that I've been discussing in previous few years really brought me back in together, working with Toni, planning, plotting ideas, visiting Barcelona to write proposals together, and really benefiting from Toni's incredible knowledge of analytical techniques and his ideas about ways that we could expand the potential for these biomarkers. So just want to echo Erin's thoughts that from the whole community owes Toni a huge debt of gratitude, and very personally want to say thank you to him for starting me on this career, and for all the wonderful opportunities it's given me. And I'm just sad that we couldn't continue the plans that we made in recent years. So thank you. This is a photo, by the way, of Toni's wonderful paella that he made when I visited with my wife, him and Helen, when we were discussing ideas for working together in the future. And for me, this really captures Toni's love of life and good company, as well as his love of science, of course. So thank you.
Shows testimonials from University from Hamburg, Max Planck Institute, Université de Quebec, Oregon State University, and the Planck Institute for Chemistry. From this last institute, a researcher who did the PhD here at ICTA, Alfredo Martinez, to remind his experience. El treball del Toni va tenir un impacte científic al voltant de tot el món. El següent vídeo presenta uns testimonials procedents de la Universitat d'Hamburg, el Max Planck Institute, la Universitat d'Oregon, la Universitat del Quebec, i també el testimoni d'un investigador que actualment està al Max Planck, però que va fer també el seu doctorat aquí a l'ICTA. També voldria aprofitar aquest moment que ens anem apropant cada vegada més als nostres temps per fer un record al seu grup que en aquests moments tenia, que era l'Impactant.
Dear family, friends, and colleagues of Anthony Rosell in Melle. My name is Kai Diemers, and I'm from Hamburg, in Germany. I was very moved by the news of Toni's passing away, and since that news, I have been thinking a lot about the time we spent together and the scientific collaboration with Toni. This collaboration goes back to the 1990s when Toni initiated a joint project funded by the EU named TEMPEST, Sea Surface Temperature Evolution Mapping Project, based on UK 37 stratigraphy. Many of you will know what that means. The main goal of that project was to reconstruct sea surface temperature maps for the geological past in the Eastern Atlantic and several other places in the world ocean. Besides project work on various aspects such as methods, intercalibration, producing these maps and comparing them with model data, there were a number of real person-to-person project meetings where we got to know each other quite well. And some of us even became friends. I remember a visit to Durham, for instance, on occasion of the defense of James Bendel's PhD thesis, which he did under Toni's supervision. And the unfortunately last face-to-face meeting was in Barcelona. He had finally found his way home to his beloved Catalonia and had just bought a house in the vicinity of Barcelona and was very happy to be back. The research community is small, even though it is international, and you always have people from the past on your radar, even if the connection is not tight anymore or active. The last I knew of Toni was that he had received a prestigious grant from the European Research Council. That must have been last year. And I was impressed because these grants are really special and hard to come by. Toni was an excellent scientist and a good colleague, and I will miss him. My sincere condolences go out to his friends and in particular to his family.
Dear family, dear friends of Toni Rosell. My name is Gerald Haug, and Toni and I met and became friends for life during my short tenure as a PhD student at Bristol University. Toni had just completed his PhD, developed a grand method to analyze alkanones, chemical ionization. He taught me that method. These months changed my life because without my stay at Bristol and Toni's mentorship, I probably wouldn't be talking to you in this function I am. I will always remember the very passionate discussions Toni and I had about science, about politics, about affairs in Catalonia, and it started to be a friendship until Toni died. I've seen the last time Toni on a sailboat out of Barcelona, which he rented. I think I once wrote him a letter for him to go to Corvallis, which I know he and his family and my big regrets, to which he enjoyed tremendously. So he invited me to this day trip, and Toni, Mark Pagani, and I had just a wonderful day. It was very much at the top of my list to do this again after the pandemic. It was planned, Toni and I had, as we shared this sailing passion, to go out of Barcelona port again and probably over to the Balearic Islands on an overnight trip. It's not happening anymore. So I'm very, very sad, as you know this, and I'm on the best.
Maybe you will remember that photo. Those who are old enough will certainly do. It was in 2003, so close to 20 years ago, during a meeting that Toni has organized at Castellet del Foix. It was near Barcelona, and it was for a meeting, during a meeting dedicated to the life threshold maximum, a Margot meeting on the proxy approach for the reconstruction of the global ocean. During these days, from the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, I had the opportunity to work closely with Toni, and it was a real pleasure. Toni was a very robust scientist with a deep knowledge of the methodology regarding alkanes, and he was quite open to other approaches. And it was very, very pleasant to work with him. Each time it was very constructive, very fruitful. Toni was a tall person, and he was very nice and very gentle. And I will keep a very good memory of all exchanges we have had during the years. So I wish Toni is still there, but I will remember him as smiling and as nice as it was during that meeting in Castellet de Font near Barcelona 20 years ago.
Hola. I met Toni about 25 years ago, but not personally. I met him through reading his literature. Then I had on occasion crossed paths with him at meetings and got to know him a little bit more personally. Then in the late 2000s, Toni approached me and asked, could he come and do a sabbatical for a year and a half? I said, bring it on. He did. He came with Helen and his two girls and set up shop here. It was a wonderful scientific time for me for a year and a half, because every day I could sit and brainstorm, talk ideas, and we even wrote a few papers together while he was here. More importantly, though, I got to know Toni and his family. My family got to know his family quite personally. And he went on a lot of mountain bike rides with me up in the hills, got to know all of my friends. We drank plenty of beer together. He became one of my closest friends. At the end of the sabbatical, when he went back, about every year he'd do his pilgrimage to the AGU. And we insisted that if he came through Corvallis, he stay with us, because he was always a great person to have in the household and to interact with. We did that for a number of years, and finally we reciprocated by taking their welcome to St. Cugat, where Karen and I went for the first time to learn about Catalonia. And we got a great lesson about Catalonia and what it was to be a proud Catalonian, which is what Toni was. It saddens me to think that he won't be in my life again, or any of our lives again, but I do know that he touched me deeply, and I will carry wonderful memories with me for the remaining time that I walk on this planet. So thank you, Toni. Thanks for all the great memories.
Toni va supervisar la meva tesi doctoral a l'ICTA entre els anys 2005 i 2009. Aquests anys guardo molt moltes coses. Encara recordo algunes de les discussions que vam tenir sobre la interpretació dels resultats de la meva tesi, o sobre com solucionar els experiments que vam sortir al laboratori, i sobretot enveja l'entusiasme que sempre mostrava en cadascun dels temes que vam investigar junts. La meva tesi doctoral es va centrar en l'estudi de la influència de l'oceà Antàrtic i la regulació de les concentracions de diòxid de carboni a l'atmosfera durant els últims 3 milions d'anys. La veritat és que els resultats de la tesi van tenir molt d'impacte i per mi van ser fonamentals per poder continuar en la meva carrera investigadora. Així que sempre estaré agraït a Toni per l'oportunitat que em va donar de treballar en aquest projecte. Després de la tesi vam seguir en contacte i vam col·laborar en els projectes d'investigació. A més, Toni sempre m'ha donat suport i bons consells sobre com continuar amb la meva recerca. Tant a l'època postdoctoral com quan més endavant vaig formar el meu propi grup de recerca aquí a l'Institut Masplan, a Alemanya. Sempre que ens veiem a alguna conferència, intentàvem quedar a sopar i posar-nos al dia. Encara que durant els últims anys, degut a la pandèmia, feia molt temps que no ens veiem i, per desgràcia, no vaig saber de la seva malaltia fins al final. Així que m'agradaria acabar aquest vídeo donant molts ànims a la seva família com a tots els companys d'ICTA. Trobarà a faltar, Toni.
Volem continuar fent aquest homenatge a la col·laboració d'alguns investigadors d'aquí de l'ICTA que ens tocaran el cant dels ocells. En la carrera científica de tota persona també té molta importància la família. És per això doncs, que tant la Júlia o la Helen m'agradaria que si podeu dir unes paraules.
Good morning. I'm Helen. No, not everyone. So I met Tony almost 34 years ago, and when I met him, I'd never met anyone with such an interest in and motivation for finding out and understanding in general. The fact is that he focused his thirst for knowledge on environmental science, but he had tremendous thirst for understanding in many areas: history, geography, politics, society, or what makes people tick. Whatever it was, Tony wanted to understand. And I think because of this, he had a massive basis of knowledge and understanding and saw links between different areas that others did not. Tony moved to England in 1990 and he worked in 3 different universities there. However, he always wanted to return to Catalonia, which, as we know, is his country and which he loved. And he wanted to be close to his family. And so when he was awarded the ICTA position in 2001, it was a very proud and important time for him. Tony was one of the first people that ICTA contracted. In fact, I think he was actually the 3rd person that they contacted about a position. Once he had his ICTA, he chose to come to ICTA. And one of the reasons that he chose ICTA was that he thought it was a place which would be more egalitarian than other departments, where he could have chosen to work. As many of you know, Tony was very involved in making this building become a reality. And so when ICTA finally moved here, he was so positive and happy about the opportunities that the move would bring to ICTA. He saw it as a real step forward for ICTA. Another incredibly important achievement for Tony was when he was awarded his ERC. Tony's preparation of the application for the ERC grant had been meticulous, and he spent much of the preceding summer working on it. Every word or phrase was carefully chosen and constructed. After submitting his application, we went through months of waiting and not knowing if he would be awarded it. However, he was confident that his idea for the project had some real merit and should be pursued, and his belief was vindicated. Toni was committed to his research. He loved his country and his family. Thank you for honouring him today. We wish all of you, his colleagues past and present, the very best with your work, and we sincerely hope that some of what he had achieved and planned will be continued to be worked on. Thank you.
Hola, jo sóc la Júlia, la filla gran del Toni. He escrit un text que primer llegiré en català i després en anglès. Hello everyone, I'm Julia. I'm Toni's eldest daughter, and I've written something that first I'll read in Catalan and then in English. Sorry. Molt del que he après del meu pare crec que va aprendre del seu treball. Per exemple, veure com el meu pare treballava per sol·licituds de beques de recerca em va ensenyar a mi que s'ha de donar-ho tot per les oportunitats que vols assolir. Per l'altra banda, veure com el meu pare a vegades no guanyava les sol·licituds que presentava i veure com aprenia i seguia endavant em va ensenyar a no patir el fracàs i seguir sol·licitant i aplicant per diferents oportunitats a la vida, encara que em semblin massa grans o difícils. Per molts anys de la meva vida, jo no sabia que hi havia gent que no els agradava el que es dedicaven. I això era per la passió i dedicació que els meus dos pares sempre han tingut per les seves feines. Aquestes lliçons jo sempre les portaré dintre i m'asseguraré d'ensenyar als meus fills i espero que continuïn formant part del que vosaltres feu aquí també. Com sabeu, el meu pare era una persona amb molta passió, qui s'emocionava escoltant música o els diferents èxits de les seves filles. Ell estimava molt a la seva família, a la seva dona, a Catalunya, a la natura, i a la ciència i la recerca i el seu camp eren un dels grans amors de la seva vida. Així que gràcies per formar part d'això amb ell. Ara en anglès. A lot of what I learned from my dad, I feel like he learned from his work. For example, seeing my dad work hard on applications for grants showed me how important it is to give it all for any opportunity. Likewise, seeing my dad not always get grants and be okay with it showed me to not fear failure and to take opportunities, no matter how big or scary they appeared. For most of my life, I didn't know that some people didn't like what they did because of the passion and dedication that both my parents gave to their jobs. These are lessons I'll always carry with me and teach to my children, and I hope that they continue to be part of your work here as well. As we know, my dad was a very passionate man who got emotional listening to music and at me and my sister's successes. He loved his wife, his family, Catalonia, and nature. But science, research, and his field were one of the true loves of my dad's life. So thank you for being part of that with him.
Moltes gràcies a la família i a totes les persones que ens esteu acompanyant avui. Quan el Toni va retornar a Catalunya, ho va fer gràcies al contracte, a la passió també de la Fundació ICTA. I m'agradaria si el seu director ens pot recordar com ha estat aquesta trajectòria. So when Toni comes to Catalonia at the beginning of this century, he comes through our contract with the Fundación ICTA. So now, Toni Huerta, director of the Fundació ICTA.
Gràcies, Xavier. Helen, Júlia, m'ho heu posat difícil, dir alguna cosa ara. Bon dia a tothom, rector, autoritats, família, colleagues and friends. As director of ICTA, I would like, first of all, to thank you all for being here in person or remotely, and more important, to allow ICTA to be here and share with you all this tribute to Toni Rosell. I have appreciated very much the presentations, bringing up and the videos, bringing up some of the most relevant aspects of the research of Toni, the impact of his research, and the impact of his personality doing research. I will not dwell on this. This is not my role today. Rather, I will use this opportunity to point out what ICTA owes to Toni a debt of gratitude. Why? Among other things, for two major things. Courage, I will explain you why in a second, and hard work. Toni, as we have heard, joined ICTA in October 17, 2001, the same year ICTA was created. He belonged to our first cohort, 32 researchers. I can assure you that at that time, 20 years ago, joining ICTA you needed a lot of courage. It was a difficult venture, the beginning of ICTA and the universities. And I appreciate that he was there for us. Today's perspective of ICTA is quite different. We have over 270 researchers, and half of them, by the way, are in the universities, and a solid list of exceptional achievements and contributions. But 21 years ago, this was a different story. So Toni courage was one of our assets. But ICTA also needed hard work to help build this solid list of achievement and contribution. And Toni was never short of commitment and hard work. ICTA is today what it is thanks to people like Toni. He demonstrated that ICTA research professors can contribute to have a stronger and more competitive universities in Catalonia. In summary, I must stress our gratitude, ICTA's gratitude to Toni, and sure hope that we gave him back a little bit of what he deserved. So I want to finish by simply citing him. In the first memoir that ICTA ever made, this is what Toni said. ICTA m'ha donat una feina que realment em fa molt feliç. ICTA has given me a job that really makes me very happy. It was the least we can do. Thank you.
A great scientific, but also he spent a lot of time with the management. He was a member of the doctoral board in the doctoral school here at the UAB, and also the deputy director of our Institute de Ciència i Tecnologia Ambiental. Toni va ser un gran investigador i a la vegada va dedicar una part molt del seu temps en la gestió. Ell va ser membre de la Junta Permanent de l'Escola de Doctorat de la Universitat Autònoma i també el sotsdirector de l'Institut de Ciència i Tecnologia Ambientals. Per tant, m'agradaria també comptar amb el rector de la nostra universitat per recordar-lo.
Es un día difícil. Veig a la família. Jo, primer, volia dir que prescindiré de les paraules protocolàries perquè crec que avui no estem aquí com a acadèmia, estem intentant recordar un amic, el doctor Rosell. Jo aquí estic com a rector, però tinc la sort d'haver-lo conegut personalment i haver treballat amb ell. I llavors, quan estava intentant veure què escrivia, què posava, no sabia què posar, perquè en aquests moments fa difícil. I dir què representava el Toni. Toni, escoltant el director de crear, és allò que tots volíem, que era la captació, la retenció de talent, ajudar-nos a progressar, a millorar, a canviar el nostre món. I si parlem de món, ell era un apassionat Jo em deia com podem definir-lo com a company, com a investigador, apassionat, negociador incansable. M'ha tocat també, a part d'estar en una banda, el director de l'ICTA deia que havia estat, però clar, quan te'l trobaves al costat era perfecte. Quan te'l trobaves a l'altra banda era dur, era la persona que defensava allò que pensava i que creia que s'havia que fer fins a l'últim moment, sense canviar. Jo crec que tenia moltes coses per dir, però ja estem en un edifici, estic veient a un dels que ho impulsaven i en aquella comissió on estava el Toni treballant també, on intentant dir com es tenien que fer les coses i suposo que van ser discussions dures, però també aquest edifici és una part de la seva herència. Crec que ens ha ajudat a comprendre el món i a veure com podem canviar-lo i com podem millorar. Trobarem a faltar. No puc dir res més. Moltes gràcies.
Hem acabat aquest acte només amb un recordatori i indicant que per recordar-lo us dediquem aquesta sala al doctor Toni Rosell i Merley. So we are now finishing this homenage, and for now this room will be called Toni Rosell and Merley. Thank you. Moltes gràcies a tothom.